And we are blessed to have one of the exemplary figures when it comes to genuine conviction and commitment. You may not always agree with our dear brother. I know Brother Tavis and I do not. But he is our dear brother. We're talking about former congressman and medical doctor Ron Paul, who was run for president, both on the Libertarian ticket and also in the Republican Party. He has a following across this nation, and he has respect for many, no matter how much you disagree. Brother Ron Paul, what a blessing to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's real nice to be with both of you.
Congressman, good to have you on. Let me start by asking how you made the decision to do Ron Paul's America. You're about to debut twice daily commentaries and a weekly podcast. When I got started years ago, before I got started, I used to listen as a kid growing up in Indiana to Paul Harvey. I just taken and fascinated by his style, by his delivery. Didn't always agree with what he had to say, but my first exposure to real insightful commentary was this guy named Paul Harvey. So now that you've left Congress, you're joining the ranks of the world that Dr. West and I inhabit. So tell me about this new Ron Paul's America.
You know, there you go, starting off with something we agree with, because I remember so clearly listening to Paul Harvey and had dinner with him once, and I thought it was marvelous. So to me, he was a real giant for radio. So we have that in common. Well, starting with radio, probably the most important reason I had two requirements for doing something in my afterlife and after politics. They say there is really a life after Washington, D.C., and that involved not straying too far from my home, because I'm about 60 miles away from a studio. And this is one thing, like today, I'm not in a studio, but modern technology allows us to communicate. And the other thing is I was invited to do it. So those two things came together, and I enjoy talking about the issues. Matter of fact, I enjoy it a lot more when it's not involved with the demagoguery that goes on in the U.S. Congress, and that wears me down. All the talking and little action. So I enjoy a conversation where we can have friendly discussions and friendly disagreements.
Well, Dr. West and I feel the same way, so I'm glad to have you on. Let me ask you one other question right quick, though, before we advance. What kinds of issues do you want to talk about? Are there themes, or are you just going to hit whatever is in the news?
It should be up-to-date, newsworthy, about the crisis going on. My favorite subjects over the years have been, first, the foreign policy and, the endless wars and the waste and the tragic blowback and unintended consequences and the financial burden that we have. So I'll deal with that. When I left Congress, I gave a little talk on the floor and said that the most crucial trend that I think that we should worry about is the violations of civil liberties, because you and I should argue the case for civil liberties, because if we lose our privacy and our right to speak out, we can't even have these discussions. So I think that's been undermined, and the thing about personal privacy and things like that. But certainly I want to talk about foreign policy, but likewise I will continue to talk about economics and why monetary policy is important, why I think it's so detrimental to the middle class and to the poor when you have a Federal Reserve that bails out the rich and forgets about the poor. So I will continue to talk about the Fed and any other issues anybody wants to talk about.
I want to yield to Dr. Wester in a second, and I want to get back, as I know, Doctor, to some of those issues you've just raised with greater specificity, and we've got some good time with you today to do just that. But I'm just curious, one final question about these commentaries, and again, Dr. West can jump right in here with us. But if you were on the air, you are on the air today, but if you were on the air today with your commentaries, since Dr. West and I just discussed this earlier in our program, what would you be saying today about the President's State of the Union address earlier this week?
I probably wouldn't talk a whole lot about it, because I think these events are more for grandstanding and not a whole lot of changes that'll occur. Democrats will line up one way and Republicans another way. And yes, the president makes a suggestion, Republicans refute it. So I really don't, like that process. I'd probably be more concerned about talking about the issues that both Republicans and Democrats support, like the use of drones, the endless wars, the endless printing of money, the privacy that we losing, the fact that both parties have more or less ignored or endorsed the principle of assassination of American citizens. I would be pushing on the issues rather than getting into the partisan stuff.
Indeed. I want to get right at the heart of both our agreement and disagreement. because it strikes me that your libertarian philosophy, of course, is something that has very deep roots in the history of this nation, and it does overlap with some of my own and Brother Tavis's own conceptions of freedom, but then there's some deep disagreements too. But let's look at it. Foreign policy, the Patriotic Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, authoritarian, autocratic, undermining precious rights and liberties, drones dropping bombs on innocent people. Those are war crimes that must be made accountable both to American people as well as international law courts, whatever it is. When it comes to domestic issues, again, your strong defense of rights and liberties, but your reluctance to really want to talk about freedom as opposed to liberty in terms of what the government can do right in ensuring that poor and working people are empowered, as opposed to the government empowering Wall Street, opposed to the government empowering corporate elites and plutocrats and oligarchs and so forth. What is the center of the disagreement then?
Well, I take the principle of individual liberty, the things that we agree on, the privacy and the right to speak out and the First Amendment and all, but I apply to that to economic matters as well. I think if you have personal privacy on your sexual life and your religious life, I think in your economic life you should have that same. Now, I understand, there's a lot of problems out there, but I see that as welfare. When it's sold to the people, they think that it's going to help the poor, but it ends up helping the rich. Think about the housing bubble. The programs were designed to help the poor. They printed money, and a lot of people bought houses that probably couldn't afford it. But then when the predictable bubble burst, the wealthy got bailed out. The middle class got hurt. It was all done in secret. Foreign banks and foreign governments were bailed out, and the big corporations. So I see that when governments interfere, they will pretend to help the poor, and they actually help the rich. I'm convinced economically, and this is where we disagree on economic policy, that free markets are more likely to help poor people than the interventionist style of trying to take care of one group versus another. I think equal justice under the law, that's real important, but not when it interferes with contracts. I see personal, social, sexual, and religious contracts as absolutely, should be, the government shouldn't regulate that at all. But I apply that same rule to economic matters as well.
Do you agree then that if we had jobs with a living wage, high quality work conditions, that's the best anti-poverty program we could have? But at the same time, you're not going to get that without downsizing or decentralizing the banks, empowering small business, empowering community banks, and ensuring that workers have a voice. Back to individual liberty, the liberty of workers. Workers have a voice shaping the conditions of their own workplace.
Yeah, what I want to do is remove the special powers given to the big guys, the banks and the corporations, but I don't want to see the word that I would want a full explanation on is when you empower. One group wants to empower the rich, the other wants to empower another group, and I want to empower the individual and give these rights to individuals that nobody can violate those rights, believing very sincerely that prosperity has more come from peace and markets than it has ever come from government programs and redistribution of wealth. There's no real historic evidence that countries became wealthy that way. I mean, the freer the market, the less poverty is, and the more peace you have, the more prosperity. I know I can't reach my goals very easily because we've lived so long with, the foreign intervention and all, and governments are also involved. But I also think in a transition, we probably can talk about, if we could just cut back on these wars, there would be more resources here to help those people who do need help. Because every time you spend $1 billion overseas, no matter what it's for, it's $1 billion one way or the other that's taken out of our economy, and that money is not available for the market.
The problem is when you talk about free market, to what degree is that a myth? When has the market ever been free? It's been corporate-driven market from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Big business has fundamentally shaped the market from the very beginning. So when you talk about liberty, why not talk about liberty for poor people, liberty for workers, or do you deny that there's classes in American society?
Yeah, no, there are classes, but there are classes there because the wealthy, the corporations, the banks grab hold of the reins of government. So I would say remove that power. Don't have a monetary system that they have complete control of. I mean, who do you think? Do you think the poor people got together and said, "Oh, let's have a Federal Reserve so my bank statements are protected"? No, it's the big banks that wanted that. So I think it backfires on the poor once you endorse the principle that the government should be involved. So no, you're right about that. Big corporations from the very early times of the railroads and everybody else, they had special benefits.
That's right.
So you've left the circus called Congress, and there's a reason why there's a reason why their approval ratings are so low. But I'm curious, though, to advance the conversation, the rich conversation that you and Dr. West were just having. If you were in Congress right now, what would you be saying? And how would you be voting on these entitlement reforms that are surely about to come up? Dr. West and I see this conversation as a fake conversation about deficit reduction. What it really is austerity. But what would you be saying? We hear your point about the wars and saving money. We agree on that. But back to Doc's question about the domestic issues, what would you be saying or doing on this entitlement reform debate that's about to kick up?
Well, I would want to apply the principles to the domestic economy as I apply the principles to foreign intervention. I want the least amount of intervention. I want to follow the Constitution. I want to protect property. I want to protect contracts. I want to protect the value of money. The money issue is a big issue. That's one of the issues we should all be talking about because there is a rule in free market economics that said if you debase the currency, if you devalue the currency and you just print the money, the middle class and the poor get wiped out as the wealthy gets wealthier. And that is what's happening. And I think the bailout was a real good example of that. So I would argue the case that government should be limited. And people say, oh, then there's no regulations. The rich are going to run roughshod. No, that's what the role of government should be. The role of government should enforce the contracts and make sure there's property rights and make sure that nobody can steal. And the corporations steal and they use fraud and sometimes they get caught and sometimes they go to jail. But the whole process, it's immoral in the sense that it's based on the use of force. We as libertarians reject the use of force. We should prevent and deal with the force, but we shouldn't, as a government, use force, and we should not give it to, special interests to use force, and that's where we are today. And this is the reason I think I do get along with so many progressives. I've had a lot of conversations with progressives who really understand the power of the corporation. Ralph Nader and I do quite well because, he sees and I sees that corporatism is the real evil. And
so Dr. West and I don't disagree on any of that. Ralph Nader's a dear friend of both of ours. The four of us are in agreement on that. Let me ask this question another way. There is this debate in Washington already underway, about to kick up now that we're past the speech this past week, of whether or not the president ought to agree to significant billions of dollars of entitlement reform cuts. On the cuts that are about to be on the table, where entitlement reform is concerned, what would you be saying on these cuts? You're voting yes or you're voting no?
Well, I would vote to cut all spending because I think we spend too much money. But I don't think anybody has to worry about cuts. I think you have to worry about the demagoguery. What's the military-industrial complex saying today? They're hysterical about the cuts. Well, there aren't any cuts. There aren't any cuts in food stamps. There aren't any cut in the military spending. There's no cuts in the bailouts. There's no cuts at all. They have this baseline budgeting that might be going up rapidly at a rate of 20%. And if the conservatives come along, that's too much. This raise at only 18%. Then the people come and say, oh, you're slashing this. So there aren't any real cuts. I think if we're going to try to salvage what we have to talk about priorities. And that's why in the campaign I talk so much about where I would cut first. And I wouldn't be cutting child health care or some of these very important things that people have become so dependent on. But I also argue the case that if you want the distribution of prosperity and well-being, it's done more if you have the rule of law and you have free markets rather than saying that you take from one group and give to another, but give nobody special benefits. And unfortunately, and this is where we agree, the special benefits and the power and the control have gone to the very wealthy.
Very true. You were one of the few to raise the issue of the new Jim Crow, of the very ugly and unjust prison industrial complex, and that was very refreshing. But as you know, libertarianism as a tradition really does not have a good record when it comes to dealing with the vicious legacy of white supremacy, dealing with Jim Crow, Jane Crow, dealing with rights of black people. Got a lot of xenophobic elements in the libertarian movement. It's not driven by racism, but you know and I know it's got racist elements in it. How do you defend your version of libertarianism, given the history of the movement, given your own history, when it comes to issues of race, when it comes to issues of how black people are to be, it will say empowered, to put that in inverted commas, and become not just a part of America, but treated with decency and dignity?
Well, I think the one thing that I can say that might challenge you a little bit, but just give me a minute, and that is I don't want to treat people because they belong to a group. I don't want to punish people because they belong to a group. I want people to be treated as individuals. And I think Tavis may remember this in one of our debates when we talked about how if you're being punished because you're in a group, then the libertarian wants to rectify it. When it comes to the drug laws, I'm the one that's been talking about that. And I don't, if you look at the number of people who use drugs and the number of people who get arrested and the number of people who end up in prison, I mean, the numbers are staggering. It can't be a fair system, because I think the civil liberties and the protection of the individual is not fair when it comes to how the minorities are treated under our drug laws. If you're caught using heroin or even marijuana, the odds of getting a more severe punishment, whether you're a minority versus Caucasian, I think there's a big difference. Yes, there is discrimination, but it's the fact that we are seeing people in groups, and there is a bias and there is a prejudice, and I think we all should reject that. But there's a lot of people out there that believe that we should use government, to mold this type of behavior, and then they become very biased.
Oh, indeed. But do you agree, though, that the libertarian movement has had problems when it comes to dealing with racism?
Well, I don't. I think some conservative groups were, but I think libertarians are different. And if they didn't come down close to what I'm saying, I would put them more in the camp of being conservative rather than libertarians. The libertarian sees, well, the basic principle is you can't use aggression against anybody else, and everybody's equal, and you should have equal justice under the law, and nobody gets benefits. So no, if you're a libertarian,
you ought to be an anti-racist to the
I really don't think people would be. I don't see how they could be racist, because they don't even see people in groups. They see people only as individuals.
Well, if you can't, as Dr. King said, if you cannot legislate morality, and you can't, but government, I believe, and I think Doc believes, has a right to protect its citizens. I'm trying to understand more of your critique of government for not. I mean, as I hear you, is it your argument that government ought not to stand in and protect these individuals? They are citizens, after all.
Well, sure, they should protect them like everybody else. Everybody should have equal protection, and if they don't, then it's unfair, and you have to change the laws. I mean, I don't see where there's a challenge on that.
But I thought I heard you say. I thought I heard you suggest, Congressman, a moment ago, that there are people who have an issue with government because they don't like it when government is expected to step in and to do X, Y, or Z. For example, the debate that raged on for years when you were in Congress about whether or not to increase the punishment for federal hate crimes. I mean, the fact that was a debate was always fascinating to me because people didn't think that government needed to distinguish, X, Y, or Z. But at the end of the day, people were being maimed and killed because of extraneous factors.
Well, the other way you look at that is if there's an identical crime committed and one is perceived to be motivated, for one reason versus another, why should one person get less punishment? Instead of saying somebody's getting more punishment, why should somebody get less punishment if they robbed somebody or killed somebody and their motivation was different? No, I think it's the act itself that has to be judged. Nobody should have less punishment or more punishment.
But I think Tavis is pushing you, though, in a wonderful way, that your night watchman conception of government, where the government is to protect property, government is to procure personal security.
Right.
Brother Tavis is saying there are groups who are weak and vulnerable. Take, for example, do you think that the government ought to protect the right of workers to engage in collective bargaining? Because it's clear that they're weak and vulnerable vis-a-vis bosses in a corporatism system that you and I and Nader and Tavis are critical of. So it seems you got to thicken this notion of government's role if you're really concerned about the individual rights of people who have been treated as if they're members of a group and cast as weak and vulnerable owing to racism.
But you have to look at which system so far has produced the greatest amount of jobs and the greatest amount of prosperity. We've generally followed what you're talking about for many, many decades, and here we have a situation where we have, 22 to 24% unemployed, more minorities than anybody else. So the thing doesn't work. But what you want to do is if a businessman mistreats in a violent manner, that's something different. But there's every moral reasons why working people should have the right to organize and the right to have a contract and right to insist on privacy, on safety. So all these things are right. But I don't see this. I see this as a contractual thing coming about out of the needs of the individuals in a voluntary contract, rather than Washington D.C. Setting up a bureaucracy that if they get enough money and enough bias, they'll write the laws and the rules to benefit the corporations. See, let's say you want to protect the environment. So the corporations go and they control the people who are writing the rules, and some get help and some don't get help. They say about medical care, we're going to help medical care for everybody. So who do they write the rules? The drug companies and insurance companies and everybody else. What about the banks? Let's make sure the banks are safe for everybody.
After all your years in Washington, what is your suggestions for how we, to the extent we can, get the money out of politics? What do we do about lobbying in Washington?
Well, there's only two ways you can do it. One is you have men and women of character that resist the temptation to even talk to them.
All right, so forget about that. Next issue.
Yeah. Well, the one thing is my method of handling them were such that they didn't even bother coming to my office. So they knew I wasn't going to change. I only want to talk to people like you that'll at least let me talk a little bit. But the other thing is that government shouldn't have much to sell, and it's less emotional to talk about the military-industrial complex. If we weren't fighting all these wars and passing this money out overseas, then there wouldn't be all these billions of dollars of money flowing into campaigns and lobbying efforts to get these contracts. They build weapons because of the lobbyists. So I think the smaller the government is, the less incentive there is to buy, the influence of the politician. But I guess you're right. We have to give up on the fact that tomorrow we're going to have an ethical Congress that will refuse to participate in this game that's going on.
So since Dr. West and I gave up on that idea a long time ago, let me ask expressly whether or not you would support then. Some believe that the only way to fix this, particularly on this side of Citizens United, there are many believe that the only way to fix this is a constitutional amendment regarding the money in our politics. Would you support that?
No, I think that misses that's treating the symptom, and I don't think that will help because the money will just go underground. We have enough rules. I mean, we have rules. Recently, they even put more rules on, the congressman about buying and selling, which personally, I resented because I couldn't even sell a stock without getting permission from a congressional bureaucrat. I mean, the assumption is that I'm guilty until proven innocent, and I have to reveal every single thing. So, no, I think that's treating the symptom, and I see the other two vehicles as the only two ways. The only thing I would suggest is you have a more honorable approach by saying, if you want to do something like this, should be a consensus, and there should be a constitutional amendment. If it passed, even if I disagreed with it, then it would be the law of the land, and we would certainly test it. They tested prohibition of alcohol and decided that didn't work too well, and they got rid of it. So maybe we could see what happens. But I like the fact that you honored the Constitution enough to say, well, let's do it up front and do it right and make everybody know what the rules are.
If we had more time, I would want to ask what your conception of democracy is and how democracy actually is in very deep tension to your notion of liberty. Because when you mention government, you always assume the government has already been controlled and colonized by corporate elites, and we agree that that needs to be called into question. But government actually can be a force for good. Government can be tied to poor people and working people writing rules, poor people and working people shaping the destiny of a nation. And that's what democracy is. It's the demos generating energy from below. Do you have a suspicion of democracy? Is that part and parcel of the libertarian tradition?
Oh, yeah, I do, because as far back as de Tocqueville, he talked about the dictatorship of the majority.
The tyranny.
The tyranny. So there's questions about how does 51% be right? I think our Constitution, the biggest flaw in our Constitution, of course, was how they dealt with slavery. And they went along with the majority. On this one, we'll compromise. We'll go with half of it. 51% will concede it. And just look at how much trouble that gave us for so many years. So the whole purpose of a free society is to make sure that you and I have our rights to live our lives as we choose, how to spend our money as we choose, to go to our church as we want, to make as much money as we want. But I just happen to have the firm conviction that society will produce the greatest amount of wealth. And once you divvy up the power in Washington, the powerful will get more powerful. And that's where I have a lot of trouble.
I think we got at the center. I think we got to the center of this. I'm a deep Democrat with libertarian sensibilities. You're a deep libertarian with a little dose of democracy added on. I think we got at the core of this thing, now, Brother Ron Paul.
Well, that's not too bad.
We've got some common ground. We've got some common ground, though.
I think that was well stated. And now that we've figured this out after 30 minutes, let me offer this as the exit question, because I want to end on a note of commonality now that Doc has made that so clear about where the distinctions are. And I say this with all due respect. You and Dr. West do have something else in common, and that is both of you are beloved by young people. I've traveled Dr. West around the world and in this country, and he's always on college, university campuses. Can't say yes fast enough to all the invitations that are coming in. So you're both beloved by young people. Your campaign was driven by young people. The money that you raised because of young people, the involvement. And I wonder if you just close by saying a word about young people and why it is that you think they so gravitate. I mean, every candidate that ran was envious of you with regard to the youth involvement. Why were these young folk running to you?
I think it's what Cornel does and I try to do, and that is tell people the truth as I see it. Don't pretend that I know everything, and be upfront with people. And young people sort this all out. So Cornel goes out and talks to them, and he's talking probably to a lot of the people that I talk to, and a lot of them will come up to me and, oh, yeah, I don't agree with you all this, but at least you're telling us the truth. And they respond to that. You know how I voted in the Congress. It was pretty independent. It wasn't a Republican. But I kept winning in my district, but my constituents would say, well, we really don't agree. They want to distance themselves a little bit. We really don't agree with everything that you do, but we know where you stand, and we can trust you. And I think that, the whole world is never going to be made up of everybody agreeing on everything. We're all going to have our disagreements. It's our ability to try to be honest with people, and young people sort that out. So I'm convinced if you tell the people, especially the young people, what you believe and explain it to them, they'll give you a fair shake.
You agree, Doc?
Oh, it's what the great Jane Austen called constancy and what we call integrity. And I think you're absolutely, we're not talking about perfection, but just being true to yourself, having convictions, and trying to tell the truth to the best of your fallible ability. You're absolutely right about that.
First elected to Congress in 1976, served there for more than 20 years, starting March 18. You can hear him on radio stations all across America with his new program, Ron Paul's America. Congressman Dr. Ron Paul, good to have you on. Thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you. Good to be back with you.